Hello! Today is the day that I usually post my weekly episode, but by fortuitous chance, it is also the day that Square Enix has officially released Final Fantasy XVI. So I've decided to forego my planned episode. Firstly, to say to everyone who's purchased it, I hope you enjoy it. I know there's been varying degrees of anticipation that have escalated with each passing trailer, teaser and demo, and the wait is finally over. We can now experience it. But I'd also like to take a moment to take a broader, more speculative look of how this entry seems to have shaped up and what it might mean for the series, based on what we've seen so far and what we might expect in the future. And to this end, it's been interesting to see the divided feedback on the entry, and I think it speaks to what we each respectively value in a Final Fantasy game, because while some have remarked of the demo, and I quote, "I haven't been this genuinely excited for a Final Fantasy release since 10, and some have equally suggested it's the best that they've seen since Final Fantasy IX, and I like all of this sort of feedback because it shows the individual barometers for individual players around what their expectations for success is for a Final Fantasy. But on the flip side, we've also had those who have lamented the clearest yet departure from, among other things, the turn-based conventions and that sort of thing that JRPGs and Final Fantasies were traditionally structured around and based around. And this is interesting because I suppose firstly, I would have thought that Final Fantasy XV and Final Fantasy VII Remake were the clearest indications of this trajectory, and it was almost an expectation that 16 would go this way. And I was more concerned around the now debunked claim that there would be no party members in this game, which is what really, I think, resurrected that debate and made there quite a contentious issue around the combat system. But on this note, one thing that has equally amused me is that the long-running RPG Dragon Quest, which has run alongside Final Fantasy as a JRPG for decades, and has always been its closest competitor, particularly in Japan, this is often a game that's recommended to those who favour the traditional turn-based combat system and the traditional aspects of the JRPG. But actually, the latest Dragon Quest game, Dragon Quest XI, while it was quite well received, one of the consistent criticisms of that is how stubbornly it adheres to these traditions of gameplay, such as the turn-based system. So, again, I suppose it's just another example of how you can't make everyone happy and how divided RPG fans are on these sorts of conventions. But on the whole, I personally feel at least the mainline numerical Final Fantasy games will continue to push this sort of action-based gameplay for the foreseeable future. But I do think, in keeping with the true tradition of Final Fantasy, it will continue to evolve the mechanics, the leveling systems, and the approaches to party-paced combat design, which I think really is the essence of what these games have always done. More so, I would say, than the turn-based systems. So, for example, Final Fantasy VII Remake, and I've mentioned this before when I reviewed that game, but I loved the combat in that game. The way they modernised and integrated the materia system, and also kind of advanced the weapon systems, I thought that was fantastic. And to me, that was more a reflection of what Final Fantasy is than it necessarily having to be turn-based. But having said that, I am a fan of the old school as well. I do love the turn-based games. So I would also like to see at least some nods to this in maybe non-numerical games in the future. And for example, we had World of Final Fantasy, which did just that a few years ago, and had this sort of throwback turn-based mechanism to it. So I would never say never, but I do hope that they sort of maintain some games with a turn-based system. Now, moving on, I think looking to storycraft, and again, people prioritise different things in Final Fantasy, and traditionally, I've always maintained that the games succeed on an ensemble of three core pillars, which is action, exposition, and exploration. But of the three, if I had to choose, personally, I would favour exposition, the story and the characters. This is what really compels me to play these games. And for example, while Final Fantasy X was comparatively linear and not big on exploration, it was the story that really compelled me and to this day makes it one of my favourite games. So, looking to Final Fantasy XVI, one thing that I really liked about the game's announcements, and that I hope will persist as a guiding principle for future titles, is that there is currently no planned DLC content. There is no planned ancillary movies or TV series or novellas for Final Fantasy XVI at this time. And that's a good thing, because while I'm not averse to these sorts of additions, I think they should always be considered as an optional post-game afterthought, orbiting and complementing a core story, rather than something that contributes directly to that story. And one of the things that I always questioned about Final Fantasy XV was that, while I enjoyed the game, trying to make it a compilation story that's told and unfolds across a range of media, with the main game being just one element of that story, it was not the best approach to storytelling, in my opinion. I don't think it could have been cohesively and sensically told like that. And while some players to this day dislike the Final Fantasy VII compilation, for example, I certainly think, regardless of your opinion of it, it has gone the right way about things, because we have the original game, which is an excellent self-contained story, and all the subsequent media, whether that's Advent Children or Crisis Core or whatever, these are complements to that core story without compromising it. They're not necessary to understanding the original game. So rather than filling in plot holes and telling sort of a cohesive chronological story, all of the compilation material is just an optional add-on to that. So in all, optimistic about that approach for Final Fantasy XVI being a self-contained story, with any potential future stuff and DLC being an addition to that rather than a necessary contributing factor. And finally, I suppose, is the world and setting. And much like with the battle system, I think this needn't be a barometer for which we can perceive future Final Fantasy games, since the worlds and settings change with pretty much every instalment, including the slightly more homogenized Ivalice games. And it's funny, because I can remember as far back as Final Fantasy VIII's release and Final Fantasy IX, when admittedly Final Fantasy still was a relative novelty with Western audiences, but there was so much speculation, and there always has been, around, is this the direction that the series is going in now? When really, if we look at the whole oeuvre of the anthology, it has always veered wildly from futuristic science fantasy, the likes of which we see in Final Fantasy VIII, Final Fantasy XIII, to the more antiquated, medieval-inspired sort of fantasy, the likes of which we see in Final Fantasy IX, Final Fantasy Tactics, and evidently now Final Fantasy XVI. But I suppose what is notable is the evidently darker tone that Final Fantasy XVI is taking, and by the looks of it, possibly more fantasy-leaning than it is science fantasy leaning. So there's no sort of spaceships and futurism that's evident so far by first impressions. So it will certainly be an interesting title. As many have quoted, it's sort of Game of Thrones in sort of tone and setting. And I'm interested to see how the mature themes play out, because while I am an adult, I can handle mature themes. I still think one of the things that draws me to Final Fantasy, and I enjoy and possibly prefer, is the whimsical, light-hearted, fellowship sort of fantasy, which I think Final Fantasy VIII, and especially Final Fantasy IX, which I think is the perfect example of that sort of tone, they tend to lean towards. This sort of, there's tragic things that happen. Vivi, of course, his sort of theme and his whole arc is quite tragic, but they have this sort of wisty lightheartedness about them as well. So I'm open to adult themes, but I do think a cornerstone of Final Fantasy has always been that redemptive sort of fellowship quest, the camaraderie and that sort of coming together as a common good, which, it may play out in Final Fantasy XVI. Obviously, Clive looks to be a more darker sort of protagonist than we might have seen. So we'll have to see what sort of form that takes. But it is interesting that they're opting towards a more adult-leaning sort of game. And it will be interesting to see if that has implications for future games. So there's a high-level view of how Final Fantasy XVI may be an indicator of what comes next, and why I think, from what we've seen so far, it's a strong indication of where the games are going, and I think they're going in a good direction for the next generation. So, of course, notably, I haven't posted any theories or speculations or reactions to many of the trailers or demos because I am going into this game blind. I watched 2 trailers a while back and I've seen 15 minutes of the demo, which was just enough to convince me to buy a PlayStation 5, which I've now done, and I cannot believe how big this bloody machine is, and also pre-order Final Fantasy XV. So, yes, I did hinge my next generation leap onto how good I thought Final Fantasy XVI looked and how good it might be. Definitely enough to convince me. And there we have it. Again, if you've pre-ordered Final Fantasy XVI, and even if you've bought a PlayStation 5, as I have for this next generation Final Fantasy, I hope you received it on time, if not a bit early, as I know some people have. I hope we all enjoy the game, and I hope this will be a solid numerical entry for the next generation of Final Fantasy.